Imagine a philosopher, right, but not just any philosopher. Someone who became this absolute sensation, drawing crowds in Paris like, I don't know, a rock star. People queuing, packing lecture halls, arguing his ideas everywhere.
But like often happens with that kind of fame, his ideas, which were really deep and nuanced, got simplified, sometimes misunderstood, even used in ways he probably didn't intend.
That's Henri Bergson, a truly revolutionary thinker for his time, pushing back against the dominant scientific and philosophical views. He tackled massive questions: time, memory, evolution, consciousness itself.
Absolutely. And his work wrestled with the very nature of reality.
Today, our focus is Henri Bergson. We're drawing mainly from Emily Herring's biography, Herald of a Restless World.
He was a philosopher whose lectures in Paris, back in the early 20th century, were more than just academic talks, weren't they? They became these huge cultural events. And the mix of people who showed up, quite something.
Oh, absolutely. Bergson had this intellectual pull, and people felt his ideas really spoke to the times. So his lectures weren't just filled with philosophers and students. You'd find mathematicians there, poets, even suffragettes, priests, actors, engineers, all sorts of people finding something relevant in what he was saying.
It really paints a picture, doesn't it? Socialists sitting here, socialites, artists next to journalists, aristocrats maybe even bumping shoulders with anarchists, and then just curious onlookers, politicians. We even know some famous names were regulars. What was it that drew such a varied crowd?
That's the key question, really. Bergson seemed able to connect different fields, asking these fundamental questions about, human experience, but in a fresh way. His lectures felt like an alternative to the dominant scientific, materialist thinking. They touched on concerns that resonated across many different groups.
So let's get started with this fascinating figure.
Indeed. Henri Bergson. Born in Paris, 1859, it was a time of, well, incredible change.
And to really get Bergson's rise, we need to understand the times he lived in, the late 19th, early 20th centuries. It was a period of huge change, intellectually and socially. Darwin's theory of evolution, for instance, that just turned everything upside down,
Mm-hmm.
challenged all the old ideas about humanity being fixed.
Mm-hmm. People are really rethinking what it meant to be human.
And on top of that, just the sheer speed of change. New scientific discoveries, new machines, new ways to travel. It wasn't just changing daily life, it was shaking up fundamental ideas about reality itself, like Heinrich Heine said about railways. He felt they were changing basic concepts of time and space. Space is killed by the railways, he wrote, and we are left with time alone. That feeling of a world speeding up, that's the backdrop for Bergson.
Okay, let's shift to his early life and education. These are the foundations, right? His father, Michael Bergson, was a musician, and his mother, Kate Levinson, came from an English and Irish Jewish background. Interestingly, the family name changed. Michael's father, Berek, had certain rights that didn't pass down to all his sons. So Michal and a brother left home, and Michal started using Bergson, which then became Bergson. It's a biographical detail, maybe not directly philosophical, but interesting nonetheless.
And the family was multilingual.
Yes, Henri and his siblings grew up speaking both French and English because of their mother. This might have subtly influenced him, that kind of British reserve, the emotional restraint, maybe even his dry sense of humor.
Life wasn't entirely stable for them, though. His father had some professional struggles as a composer, so they moved to Switzerland when Henri was about 4. His father got a job at the Geneva Conservatory. Their apartment, funnily enough, was on the Boulevard des Philosophes.
Ah, quite fitting.
But things didn't quite work out, maybe personality clashes or societal issues, we don't know for sure. Anyway, after 4 years, they moved back to Paris as the family grew and money got tighter.
But despite these moves, Bergson's intellectual gifts were clear very early on. There's this amazing story from his time at the Lycée Fontaine. He was 17, and he solved this mathematical problem Pascal had set over 2 centuries before, a problem even Fermat hadn't cracked.
Wow, really? At 17?
Yeah, his maths teacher, Desboves, was apparently just blown away. Pascal thought it needed ruler and compass methods, but Bergson used hyperbolas and parabolas. He said he didn't need to memorize proofs, he just needed to see them once. He could sort of see the mathematical relationships intuitively. It really foreshadows his later focus on intuition in philosophy.
That's incredible. But he didn't end up a mathematician.
No. Initially, he was drawn more to science, which was very much the trend then. When he got into the École Normale Supérieure in 1878, a very elite place, he was quite taken with Herbert Spencer's ideas, the big evolutionary philosopher.
And the École Normale Supérieure, that was the top tier, right? Super competitive to get into.
Oh, incredibly. You needed years of prep after your baccalaureate, tough exams. Jean
Hmm.
Jaurès, the future socialist leader, was a contemporary. Bergson actually came third in the entrance exams, which is impressive, though his name wasn't initially listed because he wasn't technically a French citizen yet.
And he and Jaurès knew each other well.
Yes, they had this friendly rivalry. There's a story about them having a mock Roman debate, and they were apparently so evenly matched that their classmates declared it a draw. Speaks volumes about the level of talent there.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing for Bergson at the École. During the oral part of the aggregation exam, that big final hurdle where you have to speak on complex topics off the cuff, he felt he'd annoyed the examiners.
Oh, how so?
The question was about the value of psychology at the time, and apparently Bergson was quite critical, expressing his disappointment with the state of the field. He still scored highly, mind you, but maybe not the absolute top mark he expected after that.
Interesting. And this period seems to mark the start of a shift in his thinking, doesn't it? Moving from Paris to teach in places like Angers and then Clermont-Ferrand must have been a change. Well, it was described as maybe more focused on leisure than deep thought. He didn't make much progress on his thesis there initially.
But Clermont-Ferrand was different.
Yes, much more stimulating, it seems. He became good friends with two maths teachers there, Constantine and Bonsen, that have these long lunch discussions, really digging into ideas. Constantine apparently had a knack for finding the metaphysics in maths problems, and Bergson also taught at the local university there. Despite some initial nerves, that teaching experience helped his own ideas start to form.
And this is where his interest in more unusual phenomena starts to emerge too, like psychical research.
Exactly. He apparently saw some hypnosis-induced telepathy demonstrations. This led him to correspond with Frederick Myers, one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research. Bergson cautiously told Myers he thought telepathy might be possible, though he admitted there wasn't solid proof yet.
And critically, this is also when he develops his key concept, durée, duration.
Yes, this is absolutely pivotal. He started analyzing how science treats time, and he realized that science, by measuring time, inevitably turns it into something spatial, like points on a line. It treats time like space.
Which he felt missed the point.
Completely. He argued this gives us a distorted, static picture of reality. Durée, for Bergson, was the real time, the flowing, continuous, mobile essence of reality that philosophy could grasp, even if science couldn't quite capture it in the same way. This was a huge break from his earlier view, influenced by Spencer, that science had all the answers.
He used the analogy of listening to music, right, to explain durée.
Yes, it's a great analogy. Experiencing a melody unfold is totally different from looking at a static painting. In music, each note flows into the next. It's continuous, always changing. Our inner life, our consciousness is like that, a constant flow where moments blend and interpenetrate. You can't just freeze it. Even seeing the same painting again isn't the exact same experience because you've changed in the meantime.
But we do tend to solidify things, don't we? Turn experiences into concepts, words.
We do, and Bergson saw why. It's necessary for practical life, for communication. But he warned that if we only do that, we lose touch with our deeper, fluid self, the actual flow of consciousness. We miss the dynamism.
And apparently he was hesitant to even talk about durée at first.
Yes, he felt this need to protect the idea, almost. He worried that trying to put it into rigid concepts too soon would somehow diminish its essence, like trying to pin down a dream. How do you conceptualize something that inherently resists being pinned down?
It's a fascinating challenge, and his ideas were really swimming against the tide at the time, weren't they? Positivism and materialism were dominant.
Absolutely. The 19th century saw this huge rise in thinking that only empirical science could give real knowledge, and that matter was the only reality. People like Comte and Spencer thought you could apply scientific methods to everything, even ethics and society. And some interpretations of Darwinism seem to suggest a kind of rigid determinism, leaving little room for freedom or, well, spirit. Charles Leonard Moore called evolution a Gorgon head, turning the soul to stone.
So there was this underlying desire to find meaning beyond just science, to sort of re-enchant the world.
Definitely. You saw it in symbolist poetry like Mallarmé's, trying to hint at hidden meanings. You saw attempts to modernize the Catholic Church and a huge revival of interest in occultism, spiritualism. Bergson's own sister, Moyna Mathers, was deeply involved in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, exploring psychic visions, rituals.
And into this mix comes Bergson's durée. How did that offer a way forward?
Well, he argued that true freedom comes from retaking possession of oneself. getting beneath the surface layer, the social self, and reconnecting with that unique, continuous flow of inner life, stepping back into pure durée. That's where he located our fundamental freedom, the creation of self by the self.
His early books got some attention in Paris, but didn't make him an international star immediately. But his public speaking, that stood out early on.
Oh, yes. Even at his PhD defense, people noted his incomparable ease, elegance, confidence. He just had this natural ability to hold an audience. His students in Clermont-Ferrand called him an enchanter. And as his fame grew, people described his lectures as completely spellbinding.
Then in 1896, he publishes Matter and Memory. This tackles the philosophy of memory, right? And he really dug into the science of the brain.
He did. He studied psychopathology, particularly aphasia language problems after brain damage. And this research led him to challenge the common idea that memories are just stored in specific spots in the brain.
Why? What was his alternative?
He argued that memories are temporal things. They exist in time, so they can't be pinned down spatially in the brain. He really elevated the status of memory. They aren't just faded copies of perception. They are the very substance of our personality, our consciousness. He wrote something like, "What are we, if not the condensation of the history that we have lived?"
And he made this distinction between two types of memory. You mentioned Edith Wharton.
Yes, he discussed it with her. She was puzzled because she could remember trivial things easily, but struggled to memorize poetry, which she loved. Bergson explained this using his two types: habit memory and pure recollection.
Okay, what's the difference?
Habit memory is learned through repetition. It becomes ingrained, almost physical, like riding a bike or reciting something by rote. It's kind of impersonal. Pure recollection, on the other hand, is the spontaneous memory of unique past events, specific images that carry the flavor of that particular moment. You can't repeat a pure recollection exactly.
So why couldn't Wharton memorize poetry?
Bergson suggested she was too dazzled by its beauty. She was in this appreciative, almost dreamlike state, which actually got in the way of the focused, mechanical effort needed to build up the habit memory required for memorization. Her aesthetic appreciation hindered the rote learning.
That's fascinating. And he knew Proust too, didn't he? His wife's cousin.
Yes, and Proust was obviously also obsessed with memory, though in a literary way. Apparently, they bonded over shared insomnia, too. Despite his growing fame, Bergson seems to have maintained a very close, private family life with his wife Louise and their daughter Jean, who is deaf. He had affectionate nicknames for them, showing a softer side.
So as Bergson's ideas gained traction, what's the atmosphere like at the big universities, like the Sorbonne?
Still very much dominated by positivism, that emphasis on science and empirical facts. And for some students like Raissa and Jacques Maritain, who later became important Catholic thinkers, this felt, well, empty. They were searching for something deeper.
And Bergson, despite his growing fame, managed to find quiet time.
He seemed to have a knack for creating these pockets of silence. But the demands of fame, the sheer effort of writing books like Matter and Memory, took a toll. He started suffering from fatigue, chronic insomnia. He even wondered later if life might have been better, or at least calmer, if he'd stayed in Clermont-Ferrand.
Now, the Collège de France seems different from the Sorbonne, more open.
Yes, definitely. Back in the 1860s, universities were largely closed to women, but the Collège de France was more welcoming. Basically, anyone interested enough could attend lectures there.
And there was this figure, Marie Raffalovich. She was quite influential.
Very much so. She'd been close to the famous physiologist Claude Bernard, and she ran a prominent literary salon, wrote articles. She was a real trendsetter in academic Paris. Bergson likely sought her support, recognizing her influence, and she became a powerful friend and ally, possibly helped his career progress.
So Bergson gets a temporary post at the Collège de France in 1897, and then a lectureship back at the École Normale Supérieure, where he taught Charles Péguy.
And Péguy was key, wasn't he? He started bringing those disillusioned Sorbonne students, like the Maritains, and also Georges Sorel, over to hear Bergson. Péguy saw Bergson as a kind of intellectual dowser, finding fresh sources of thought, unlike the Sorbonne, which he felt was too dry and critical. People were captivated. Evelyn Underhill said she was drunk with Bergson. Maurice Maritain felt she'd rediscovered intellectual joy.
And 1897 is also when Laughter comes out. An essay on the comic. Seems a bit different.
Maybe on the surface, but it connects directly to his core ideas about life, evolution, that tension between the vital, fluid aspects of life and the rigid, mechanical tendencies of matter. He argued that society needs elasticity, adaptability. Laughter, for Bergson, is a social corrective. It targets rigidity, rigid bodies, rigid minds, rigid characters.
Like the Chaplin example, getting stuck in repetitive movements.
We laugh when someone rigidly follows a habit in a situation that clearly needs a different response. So laughter isn't just fun. It polices antisocial behavior, encourages adaptability, gently mocks things like vanity, which show a lack of awareness of others.
He also talks about artists and laughter, doesn't he? Having a special kind of vision.
Yes, he suggests artists can pierce through the veil of generalizations we usually use to navigate the world. They see the unique, singular nature of things directly. Like truly understanding a character in a novel, it's not about descriptions, it's an intuitive grasp of their whole being all at once. And it was this growing emphasis on intuition as a way of knowing that really started to boost his international fame.
But not everyone was convinced. People like Bertrand Russell had criticisms.
Oh, definitely. Russell and also Felix Ledontek took issue with his language. They found it vague, ambiguous, not precise enough, and they really disliked the concept of intuition, seeing it as subjective, anti-rational even.
Russell, the logician, saw Bergson as a mystic.
Pretty much. Russell thought his own logical analysis would eventually make Bergson's philosophy obsolete. Ledontek, coming from science, thought the metaphorical style was dangerous, might encourage mystical tendencies. They both felt it lacked scientific rigor.
But Bergson didn't see himself as just a poet, did he?
Not at all. He saw himself as advancing philosophy, transforming it. His supporters argued that his poetic style was necessary to express things that rigid conceptual language couldn't capture. It was a philosophical alternative to purely scientific ways of thinking.
His interest in psychical research also drew criticism.
It did. Even though he tried to be careful and follow experimental methods, some philosophers, like Alphonse Darlou, thought it was risky territory, potentially exploitative. And apparently when he gave a big lecture on it, the public was a bit disappointed he didn't reveal any sensational new findings.
Despite the critiques, his career continued to advance. He got the chair of modern philosophy at the Collège de France in 1900.
Yes, which let him align his teaching more closely with his research, just as his following was really starting to grow.
And then came Creative Evolution in 1907. This seems to be the book that really broadened his appeal, tackling the meaning of life itself.
Absolutely. This was huge. It cemented him as a philosopher who spoke to very wide concerns, far beyond just academic circles.
It's interesting to think about early cinema around this time. Just the wonder of seeing movement captured. Even simple films like L'arroseur arrosé, The Watered Sprinkler, fit his theory of laughter, right? The mechanical repetition.
It does. And Bergson, though apparently he never actually went to the cinema, analyzed how it worked. He saw that it creates the illusion of movement from still frames. The movement isn't in the frames themselves, it's created by the projector, by our perception. He saw a parallel there with how our intelligence reconstructs the flow of reality from static concepts instead of grasping its dynamism directly.
So this leads to his idea of humans as homo faber, the toolmaker. Intelligence evolved for practical action.
He argued our intellect is shaped for making things, manipulating matter. It's adapted to the contours of inert stuff, which makes it less suited, he thought, for understanding fluid realities like life itself, or consciousness.
So intelligence isn't enough. We need something else.
That's where instinct and, crucially, intuition come in. He wasn't saying intuition is better than intelligence, but that it's needed to access durée, the flow of life, which intelligence tends to chop up and freeze. He actually saw science and philosophy as needing to collaborate, with philosophy helping science recognize its own limits.
But he got labeled as anti-rationalist sometimes.
Yes, often misunderstood. His point was more that intellect isn't our only tool for understanding reality. But yeah, as his fame exploded almost to cinematic levels, as some said, nuances like that often got lost.
And this is happening when evolutionary theory itself is still being debated, right? Darwin's specific ideas weren't universally accepted yet.
Correct. There was still a lot of skepticism about natural selection as the sole mechanism. Later, someone like Julian Huxley praised creative evolution precisely because it offered this grand vision of evolution as a unified, ongoing creative process.
Bergson's language itself reflects this dynamism, doesn't it? All the fluid metaphors.
Very deliberately. He used images like a current flowing or a shell exploding into fragments because he felt metaphorical language could better convey the mobility of reality than rigid concepts could. It was meant to guide the reader towards a more intuitive grasp,
And the most famous metaphor is the Elan Vital, the vital impulse.
Yes, the core concept of creative evolution.
Mm.
It's this initial, ongoing, driving force of life. He saw it as analogous to consciousness, creative, unpredictable, always pushing against the resistance of matter. It's not a pre-planned program, like Driesch's and Henri Bergson rejected that kind of finalism. The Elan Vital works through matter, propelling life forward in its unique temporal way, its durée.
And after creative evolution, the crowds at his lectures became enormous.
Unprecedented. His ideas just took off, spreading everywhere, being interpreted and applied in all sorts of ways, often very different from each other. He himself said he felt engulfed and overwhelmed by it all, like his own ideas were exploding into fragments, just like his shell metaphor.
And people were writing to him from all over the world.
Constantly, wanting clarifications, asking his opinion on their own work, and apparently he spent a huge amount of time personally answering these letters by hand. Shows a real dedication to engaging with his audience, despite the pressure.
Then in 1911, he lectures in Britain for the first time, at Oxford, laying out his philosophy, Durée, for an English audience.
Which didn't entirely please everyone back home, or rather across the channel. Bertrand Russell, in particular, seems to have felt quite jealous and, frankly, spiteful. He saw Bergson as a rival and actively tried to discredit him in lectures.
Even though he found him charming personally.
Apparently so. But philosophically, Russell dismissed Bergson's ideas as just pretty fairy tales, lacking logical backbone.
There was also that focus on the women attending his lectures.
Yeah.
Journalists making a fuss.
Yes, there was quite a bit of that. Sometimes using those old misogynistic tropes, comparing them to Molière's precious ridicules, implying they were just fashionable socialites, not serious thinkers.
Yeah, and this was happening alongside debates about women's suffrage in France. What were Bergson's views?
He stated publicly he believed men and women had equal intellectual capacity. However, he seemed hesitant about immediate universal suffrage, maybe suggesting a slower approach. And he definitely wasn't keen on the more militant tactics some suffragettes were using.
Then in 1913, he goes to the U.S. Big trip.
Huge. And he got an incredibly warm welcome there. Much warmer, it seems, than from some of the Cambridge philosophers like Russell. William James had paved the way, championing Bergson, so Americans were really receptive. Many saw him as a kind of restorer of spirituality in a world becoming too materialistic.
His New York lectures were packed.
Massively so. Made a huge impact. Interestingly, his philosophy also attracted some people on the far left, which made Bergson himself a bit uncomfortable. He felt his ideas were being twisted, used in ways he never intended.
That seems to be a recurring theme misunderstanding. Peggy noticed it too, right?
Yes, Peggy shrewdly observed that Bergson was almost equally misunderstood by his fans and his critics. Key terms like intuition, durée, Elan Vital, they just got reshaped and redefined by whoever adopted them. His ideas took on a life of their own.
Now going back a bit, the Dreyfus Affair was a massive event in France. Did Bergson speak out?
Conspicuously, no. He remained silent. Given the intense anti-Semitism at the time and his own Jewish background, it's quite possible he simply wanted to avoid drawing attention to himself. Other Jewish intellectuals were vocal defenders of Dreyfus, but Bergson stayed quiet.
But World War I changed his public role.
Dramatically. When war broke out in 1914, he'd just been elected president of the Académie des Sciences Morales et Politiques. He felt this sense of scientific duty to support the Allied cause. His wartime speeches became quite fiery, using his philosophy, especially the Elan Vital, to frame the conflict as France representing civilization against German barbarism.
Did he feel comfortable with this role?
He felt it was his duty, but he also expressed regret that he could only use words while others were fighting and dying. He undertook diplomatic missions, propaganda work. He even went on a top-secret, very dangerous mission to the U.S. in 1917.
What was that for?
To persuade President Woodrow Wilson to bring the U.S. into the war. It was perilous German U-boats were a major threat in the Atlantic. He met with Wilson and likely appealed to his philosophical side, perhaps reinforcing Wilson's ideas about a future League of Nations.
He must have been relieved when the war ended and France survived.
Immensely so. Though later, reflecting on the war, he seemed almost critical of that initial exultation that swept Europe in 1914. And notably, after the war, he opposed calls to kick foreign members out of the academy, resisting that nationalistic impulse. But that wartime intensity, that uncharacteristic virulence, did contribute to his popularity waning in the interwar years.
And then came the famous clash with Einstein in 1922.
This huge fame combined with his direct philosophical challenge to the mechanistic view of time. Well, it set the perfect stage for his most famous public encounter.
So by the 1920s, Einstein's theory of relativity had just fundamentally changed physics' understanding of space and time, uniting them into space-time, where past, present, future could be seen coexisting in this, well, radically different way from Bergson's flowing duration.
Right, and the context the sources highlight is crucial. Einstein got his Nobel Prize in Physics in 1922. But interestingly, it was officially for the photoelectric effect, not relativity, partly because relativity was still seen as philosophically contentious.
And Bergson was named as a key opponent in that philosophical sphere.
Explicitly, yeah. The Nobel Committee mentioned Bergson as a main philosophical challenger. So the scientific world knew Bergson was the guy questioning relativity's implications. And the sources show Bergson had actually been grappling with relativity for over a decade. He felt it was his duty, his word, to examine Durée in light of Einstein's physics. He'd even gone back to studying math and was planning a book arguing his ideas were compatible with relativity.
Okay, so the stage is set, which brings us to that specific meeting, the legendary one, at the Société Française de Philosophie in April 1922.
That's the one. And Bergson, who generally disliked public debates, he felt they forced you to objectify fluid thoughts, hadn't actually expected to be called on to speak that day.
But he was, and he did. And the sources lay out his core argument pretty clearly. He accepted relativity as a physical theory, right? He wasn't questioning the math, the experiments.
No, not at all. His point was, as he put it, once the theory of relativity has been accepted as a physical theory, all is not finished. He argued philosophy still had a vital job to do, determining the philosophical meaning of the concepts relativity introduced, especially time.
So his claim was essentially that Einstein's time, the measured, spatialized, divisible time of physics, was just different from his Durée, lived psychological time. And both could exist. One describes physical reality, the other describes lived reality.
That was his argument, yes, that they could coexist, each valid in its own sphere. Philosophically, there was room for both.
And Einstein's response was somewhat shorter.
Devastatingly so, according to the sources. His famous line was simple, direct. The time of the philosopher does not exist.
Wow. Just dismissive. Looking back, it really seems like they were talking completely past each other.
That's exactly how the sources frame it, a fundamental misunderstanding. Bergson was asserting the reality and importance of lived, subjective time for a full understanding. Einstein, speaking from physics, seemed to be saying that the measurable, physical time described by relativity was the only time relevant to describing objective reality. Any other time was just not real in a scientific sense.
Yeah, each asserting the primacy of their own discipline's view of time.
Pretty much, yeah.
And Bergson tried to respond in his book Duration and Simultaneity.
He did, but the narrative largely became that Bergson just didn't understand the physics. Leading physicists criticized his grasp of relativity, especially the twin paradox. Bergson felt deeply misunderstood and eventually just withdrew from the debate. This really cemented the public image of Einstein triumphant and Bergson as, well, out of touch with modern science.
Did he withdraw from public life entirely then?
Not immediately. He was still involved in things like education reform committees, but his health started to seriously decline in the mid-1920s. This obscure illness baffled doctors, and various treatments didn't help much. So gradually, yes, he faded from public view and from collective memory to some extent.
But he kept working intellectually.
Remarkably so. Despite poor health, these later years produced what many think is his greatest work, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, published in 1932. Here, he offers this really original take on morality and religion, seeing them as expressions of life itself, extensions of the Elan Vital.
And he introduced ideas like closed and open societies.
Yes. Closed societies are driven by instinct, focused on group cohesion, often leading to conflict with outsiders. Open societies represent a move towards universal love, inspired by mystics, aiming for a broader humanity. He explores how he might move from the closed to the open. In his will, he reflected on his Jewish roots and his affinity for Catholicism, but decided against converting, explicitly stating it was out of solidarity with those facing persecution due to rising anti-Semitism. His wife later removed a passage that might have been seen as contentious.
In his very last moments. Still thinking about memory.
The anecdote suggests so. A fascination with the idea of a total memory appearing just before death. It connects right back to his lifelong belief that fundamentally no memory is ever truly lost.
What an incredible journey. From math prodigy to this globally influential philosopher, captivating such diverse audiences.
Truly remarkable. And his core concepts, Durée, intuition, the Elan Vital, they really did shake up how people thought about time, consciousness, life itself. Plus, his engagement with science, with the social issues of his day, it shows the sheer breadth of his thinking.
Yet, as we've seen, his fame came with controversy, misunderstanding, factors that led to his influence fading later on. But his contributions remain incredibly significant.
Absolutely. And perhaps his ideas still hold relevance for us now. Think about it. We're still grappling with rapid change, the nature of consciousness, the experience of time in our own technological age. What might Bergson's non-systematic way of thinking, his focus on intuition alongside intellect, offer us as we face today's complex challenges? That's certainly something worth reflecting on.